Hi everyone, Professor Kidwai again. Let's now talk about the use of repetition, okay? Of repetition in the film The Royal Tenenbaums. Give me just 1 second so I can magnify this. Okay, repetition. Now I already mentioned in the audio lecture that if we look at repetition outside of the world of design, right? If we think about repetition in the psychological sense or the psychoanalytic sense, why are people repeating things from the past? Well, oftentimes the source of repetition in a psychic sort of sense is trauma, is the wound, right? Repeating behaviors to understand the wound, repeating behaviors maybe to undo the trauma, okay? Now, this is a really important thing to keep in mind because every Wes Anderson film is filled with repetition. And, there's a thing about design when it comes to Wes Anderson movies or appreciating Wes Anderson's films is that, he's always really kind of like cutesy and precious. And some people like the preciousness and some people are like, oh my God, I can't stand it, right? I don't know where I stand. I used to really like it when I was younger and now I'm just like bitter and old. So I'm not really sure where I stand, right? If you can appreciate it, if you can appreciate that repetition, I think it will be useful for you to understand that it's not only about some kind of visual harmony. It is very visually stimulating and visually harmonious, but there's meaning embedded into it. And that meaning might even be subconscious. The auteur, right? To use auteur in now the sense of author, right? The auteur may not even be conscious of it, but we know from literary analysis, from Roland Barthes, for example, we know that it doesn't really matter what the author's intention is in the analysis of a work. The author is quote unquote dead once the work comes out. Our analysis, the reader's analysis, the spectator's analysis, the viewer's analysis, takes on a life of its own and an importance of its own. So Wes Anderson himself may not be aware of why he uses this repetition, but we can speculate what the repetition means, okay? So my thesis, my hypothesis is going to be that the repetition, the visual repetition in his films reveals a kind of psychological trauma in which the subject, the psyche, is repeating events, is repeating things in order to understand or perhaps work out the trauma, or maybe they're just stuck in it, right? Think about that saying, you're stuck like a broken record. What does that mean? It means this kind of existence of repetition, okay? So there are tons of examples of repetition. Most of them I'm going to go through so quickly. Here we see, this this hilarious album cover that Margot happens to be in. I don't know what we think about that it's supposed to be like Bob Marley. It's supposed to be based on, what's that horrible woman, Anna Wintour, right? That Anna Wintour supposedly had a relationship with Bob Marley. There's a theory that the CIA assassinated Bob Marley. I always wonder if Anna Wintour played a role in that. But anyway, here we have this album cover. Here we have, many of the books or many copies of the book that Ethel ended up writing on her family. Here we have poor Richie's, moment of breakdown captured forever for eternity on, the magazine cover meltdown. And it's such a great image. Like, he's got the one sock on. We don't know what happened to his other sock. The shoes are here. He's got this meltdown happening. I'm sure if we were to look carefully here, I haven't looked at here yet, but I'm sure that someone interesting is hidden in this background. Here we have Eli's book. I mean, all of these are characters who are traumatized, right? Obviously we know Margot's trauma of being the adopted daughter, Ethel's trauma of being basically abandoned by this worthless husband, Richie's trauma of being in love with his own sister, Eli's trauma of always being on the outside, never being on the inside, right? So the repetition here in this sense can be connected to all of these different traumas, right? But this is where it gets really brilliant and really interesting. Who is not shown? Who is not represented by those kind of simplistic examples of repetition that I just demonstrated? Chaz, right? Chaz is not represented. All the characters are traumatized. I'm not going to rank their traumas or rank their oppressions, right? But Chaz suffers a really deep trauma because his trauma isn't only in childhood, right? He too, like all the other family members, he too is abandoned by Royal, right? Royal, who is larger than life in this composition of this frame. Royal, who is like a giant, he's like the size of the trees, right? In comparison to the other family members who were traumatized by him. Chaz is traumatized by Royal, but Chaz loses his wife. Okay. And I don't know if any of you are married in the class, but like, I'm married. And what is my single biggest nightmare on earth? The idea of my husband dying. Like, my biggest fear. Okay. So Chaz has survived that. He survived that. It's this dual layer of utterly disastrous trauma that he's survived. And Wes Anderson does such a good job, you guys. He's so brilliant in how he captures this on film. I mean, it's this reason alone that I assigned this film, okay? I could assign any Wes Anderson movie, but it's this reason. It's this reason because what he does is he uses the children of Chaz, right? These young boys who are like mini Chazes, right? They have the same haircut and they have the same costuming and the same shoes. He uses these mini Chazes as a way to represent Chaz regressing back to his child self. That's another psychological phenomenon that in the face of trauma, we regress, right? Or in the remembering of trauma, we regress. We go back in time to the child self, to the safer self, right? And here, if we want to talk about the radial spiral, radial balance, the golden spiral, right? We see Chaz going back in time. Here he is caught between these two totems of trauma: his father, the past; the grave, the present, the wife's grave. And he's stuck in the middle, literally, right? And so Chaz, wanting to escape the trauma, wanting to withstand the trauma, is regressing back to childhood, and it's captured on the golden spiral. It's captured in this radial balance. Isn't it brilliant, you guys? It's so beautiful. Like I'm sounding excited, but I have tears in my eyes as I'm describing it to you. It's this perfect, it's so good, it's so brilliant. It's this perfect demonstration of how we can use mise en scène to visually express the most elusive, the most effervescent kind of psychological interior conflicts, okay? Let's look at another example of this. Here we have Chaz in the aftermath of that fire alarm, right? I mean, think about who this person is as an individual, that in the middle of the night, these kids have to go to school, okay? The little one isn't even dressed. The little one is half naked on the street, right? I mean, they're not even properly dressed. They have to go to school tomorrow, okay? And here he is, so afraid of losing the remaining family members that he has, that he's ripping these children out of sleep, okay? He's ripping them out in their own trauma. This is going to be the trauma the kids remember when they're adults, right? He's ripping these kids out of sleep just so that he can make sure he'll never lose these kids again, okay? So now we can think Chaz is in the middle here, but the repetition of the little Chaz and the littlest Chaz, right, is demonstrating again a kind of regression. It's not exactly on the spiral, although we could say it's on the spiral. It's not exactly on the spiral. In this case, it's more that Chaz is right in the middle, and he's regressing back to these earlier states, okay? Let's pause here, and I'll start a different video lecture.